In the months after the guns fell silent, Allied officers sat across from the men who had commanded Hitler's armies, captured German generals, their uniforms stripped of power, answered a single question again and again: which enemy did you fear the most? The answers were not what anyone expected. The British, they said, were professional, methodical, predictable. The Soviets came like a flood, endless and willing to bleed. But when the conversation turned to the Americans, something changed in these hardened men. They reached for darker words: unpredictable, aggressive, terrifying. It made no sense. Just 2 years earlier, American soldiers had been slaughtered in their first real battle, routed so badly that German troops laughed at the amateurs from across the ocean. 6,000 men lost in a single week. Tanks burning across the Tunisian valley. It should have been the end of the story. It was only the beginning, because something happened to those green American boys that no German commander had ever seen before. They did not break. They learned, and they learned faster than any army in history had a right to. This is the story of how the least experienced soldiers on the battlefield became the enemy, that veteran German troops came to dread above all others, and why the reason still matters today. The interrogation rooms of 1945 were quiet places. No artillery, no screaming engines, just a table, a translator, and a defeated man being asked to explain how the world had turned against him across occupied Germany. Allied intelligence officers sat down with thousands of captured generals and staff officers, men who had spent years planning the movements of millions. Their answers were gathered into what became the Foreign Military Studies collection, preserved today in the National Archives, and buried in those pages was a pattern that no one had predicted. When these German commanders were asked which enemy they had feared the most, they did not hesitate over the British. The British, they said, were professionals, careful, methodical, everything done by the book. And the book was one the Germans had already read. The Soviets earned a grimmer respect, an enemy that came in endless waves and paid in oceans of blood until something finally gave way. But when the conversation turned to the American, these hardened men reached for a different vocabulary, unpredictable, aggressive, terrifying. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had felt it firsthand in his private papers, published only after his death. He wrote about the American soldiers he had fought in the deserts of Tunisia. After shattering them in their first great battle, he observed that their tactical conduct in defense had been first class. He noted that the Americans had recovered very quickly after the first shock and had soon succeeded in damming up the German advance by regrouping their reserves at the passes. This was not a courtesy extended to a beaten foe. This was a professional soldier admitting that he had seen something he did not fully understand, and that it frightened him. To grasp why veteran German troops came to fear the Americans more than the British, they had been fighting since 1940. You have to begin at the lowest point. You have to begin with a defeat so complete that it should have ended American credibility forever. In February of 1943, Green American troops stumbled into their first major battle against the veteran German army at a remote mountain pass in Tunisia called Kasserine, and they walked straight into a catastrophe of their own making. The man in command was Major General Lloyd Fredendall, leader of the American Second Corps. Fredendall ran his war from an elaborate headquarters built roughly 70 miles behind the front lines. His engineers spent 3 full weeks blasting and digging an underground bunker complex into a Tunisian hillside, safe and deep, while the soldiers who depended on him held exposed positions across a wide and broken front with no coherent plan to defend them. General Dwight Eisenhower later wrote in his memoir that this was the only time in the entire war he saw headquarters of that rank so concerned for its own safety that it dug itself shelters underground. Fredendall rarely visited his forward units. He issued orders in a strange private code that left his officers guessing at what he actually wanted them to do. His forces were scattered, confused, and desperately unready. The 168th Infantry Regiment received 450 replacement soldiers just days before the German assault. Many of these men had never finished basic training. Some arrived without rifles in their hands. The bazooka, the American infantryman's primary weapon against tanks, reached the front line. On February 12th, only 2 days before the storm broke over them, picture those men in the cold desert nights. Boys from Iowa and Texas who had crossed an ocean to a country whose name they could barely pronounce. Cleaning weapons they had held for only hours. Listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a front they did not understand. On February 14th, the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions struck. What followed was not a battle, it was a rout. The dawn came apart in a roar of engines and the flat crack of high-velocity guns. American tanks rolling forward to counterattack were picked apart piece by German crews who moved and fired as a single coordinated machine. Columns of black smoke climbed into the pale Tunisian sky. Each one a Sherman with a crew inside it. Infantry positions dissolved under the combined weight of armor and screaming aircraft. Communication collapsed. Men who had never seen combat found themselves running through wadis choked with dust. Past burning vehicles and the bodies of friends with no officer in sight and no idea where the front had gone. Units pulled back without orders, then without direction, then without hope. By the night of February 16th, Second Corps had lost around 1,600 men, nearly 100 tanks, dozens of half-tracks, and much of its artillery. Panic rippled backward through the rear headquarters. Over the following week, American forces fell back almost 50 miles. In confusion and fear, Rommel's panzers pushed through Kasserine Pass itself on February 20th, driving toward the vital supply depots and threatening to tear the entire Allied line in two. By the time it ended, American casualties had reached roughly 6,300 men. German losses numbered fewer than 1,000. It was a humiliation, plain and total, and to the Germans it confirmed everything they had believed. The soldiers who had fought at Kasserine remembered the Americans with open contempt. Their officers could not coordinate. Their artillery fired blindly. Their infantry broke and ran. The moment German steel appeared on the horizon, these amateurs from across the Atlantic were no threat to the professional Wehrmacht. Everyone could see it. And then, in the final days of that same battle, something strange began to happen. As German columns pushed through the pass and drove on toward the American supply dumps near Thala and Tebessa, they ran headlong into resistance that had not been there before. The American artillery, so ragged and blind at the start, began to find its rhythm. Guns that had fired at nothing, now fired with purpose. The reserves that had been flung uselessly across the map started to gather at the critical points, the passes and the road junctions, where a defense could actually hold. The German advance slowed, then it stopped, then, impossibly, it began to slide backward. Rommel had come expecting to exploit a clean breakthrough. His plan called for driving through the western mountains and unhinging the entire Allied position in Tunisia. Instead, he found himself staring at an enemy that was learning to fight while it was still losing. The Americans had been beaten as badly as an army can be beaten. 6,000 of them were gone, but they had not broken. They had begun to adapt while the shells were still falling around them, while the smoke of their own burning tanks still hung in the desert air. For a German soldier, this was a deeply unsettling thing to witness. He had been taught that war was a craft refined over generations, and that a green army thrown against veterans would simply come apart the way a poorly made blade shatters against a good one. That was the natural order. That was what had happened to the French in 1940 and to so many others since. An amateur army was supposed to lose, and having lost, it was supposed to stay lost, but the Americans at Kasserine did not follow the script. They studied the men who had just crushed them. Even as those men were still trying to finish the job, they noticed what had gone wrong, and they started fixing it in real time, without waiting for permission, without waiting for the safety of a classroom far behind the lines. A German officer standing on that ground in late February of 1943 might have felt a small, cold question forming in the back of his mind. If this is what they do after losing, what will they do once they learn to win? He could not have known how quickly that question would be answered. He could not have known that the humiliation at Kasserine was already being torn apart and examined by American commanders who refused to simply blame the men and move on. He could not have known that the army which had just been routed was about to reinvent itself in a matter of weeks, not through the genius of any single general, but through something far more dangerous. A system, a way of turning failure into knowledge and knowledge into a weapon faster than any enemy had ever seen. The Germans had won the Battle of Kasserine Pass. They had every reason to celebrate every statistic on their side, every prisoner and every burned-out tank as proof of their superiority. And yet the men who had fought there carried away a faint unease they could not quite name. They had beaten the Americans. They had not frightened them. And in the war that was coming, across the mountains of Italy and the hedgerows of France and the frozen forests of the Ardennes, that difference would come to mean everything. The soldiers laughing at the amateurs in the winter of 1943 did not yet understand what they were looking at. They saw a defeated enemy. They did not see the beginning of a transformation that military historians would study for the next 80 years. A transformation that would take an army from the worst humiliation of its war to the terror of the German soldier in less time than it takes to train a single replacement. It began, as these things often do, with a decision made far from the front, a decision to stop making excuses, a decision to look honestly at the wreckage and ask a simple, brutal question that the German High Command was rapidly losing the ability to ask itself. What did we do wrong? And how do we fix it before the next battle? The answer to that question would arrive in Tunisia within days, wearing ivory-handled pistols and a scowl that could freeze a man in his boots. And the Germans who had just won at Kasserine were about to meet the American army they should have been afraid of all along. On March 6, 1943, a new commander arrived to take charge of the shattered Second Corps, and the men who served under him would remember the day the way you remember a sudden change in the weather. Major General George Patton stepped out of his vehicle into the Tunisian dust, sirens wailing ahead of him, ivory-handled pistols on his hips, and a glare that seemed to find every unbuttoned collar and every unshaven face in the entire theater. Eisenhower had relieved Fredendall quietly and sent him home to train troops in the safety of the United States, where he would spend the rest of the war. The Army had not simply blamed one man and moved on. It had looked at its own systems, found them broken, and reached for someone who would break the men back into shape. What Patton found disgusted him. Officers lingered far behind the front, where danger could not reach them. Discipline was loose. Uniforms sloppy. Salutes rare. Units fought as scattered fragments. Infantry here and armor there and artillery somewhere else entirely, each fighting its own private war. He set about fixing all of it with a fury that terrified his own staff nearly as much as it would soon terrify the enemy. He fined men for missing helmets and missing neckties. He ordered his officers forward to the front lines, where they could see the fighting and be seen by the soldiers doing it. When one of his division commanders remarked that his unit had enjoyed the good fortune of losing no officers in a day's fighting, Patton reportedly snapped that this was not good fortune at all. It was bad for the morale of the enlisted men who needed to see their officers taking the same risks they took. He wanted his leaders bleeding alongside their soldiers. not surviving comfortably behind them. But Patton did more than shout and punish. He rebuilt the way Second Corps fought. He welded infantry, armor, and artillery back together into combined teams that moved and struck as one. He established clear chains of command so that a soldier under fire knew exactly whose orders to follow, and above all, he demanded that every operation be backed by the maximum weight of firepower the Army could bring, in a matter of weeks, by nothing more than the force of one man's will. The Corps that had fled 50 miles in panic became an instrument capable of standing its ground and hitting back. The Germans did not have to wait long to feel the difference. On March 23, 1943, barely 6 weeks after Kasserine, the 10th Panzer Division launched an attack near a dusty Tunisian town called El Ghetar. This was the same division that had torn through American positions at Kasserine. The same veterans who had watched the amateurs run. They came expecting another easy morning. At 6 o'clock, some 50 German tanks rolled out of a mountain pass into the El Ghetar Valley, arrayed in a broad screen with armored vehicles and half-tracks and motorcycle infantry, artillery firing over their heads as they advanced. The formation swept forward fast, overrunning the forward American infantry and gun positions in its path. 2 German tanks pushed so close to the headquarters of the American 1st Infantry Division that staff officers urged their commander, Major General Terry Allen, to fall back to somewhere safer. According to the accounts that survive, Allen refused. He said he would like hell pull out, and that he would shoot the first man who did. Then the German attack ran into the ground. The Americans had prepared. The panzers hit a minefield laid across their path, and 8 tanks blew apart almost at once. Tracks torn away and hulls split open by the buried charges. The formation stumbled, its momentum broken, crews trying to pick a way through the obstacle. And that was the moment the new American Army revealed itself. Forward artillery observers with portable radios called down concentrated fire from battery after battery. Hidden tank destroyers of the 601st Battalion opened up from concealed positions on the stalled German armor. By 9:30 in the morning, the Germans had lost 30 tanks and were pulling back toward the pass they had come from. The attack meant to sweep the Americans away had been stopped cold in 3.5 hours. It got worse for the Germans that afternoon. American signals intelligence intercepted the radio traffic and learned that a second assault was coming later in the day. This time, the Americans were waiting. When the German infantry advanced in the late afternoon, supported by the tanks that had survived the morning, they walked into a wall of steel. American gunners used airburst shells that exploded above the advancing men, raining shrapnel down onto soldiers who had no cover from an enemy that struck from directly overhead. They masked the fire of multiple batteries so that all the shells arrived together, giving no warning, no time to drop and hide. For the first time in the entire war, American forces had stopped a full German Panzer Division in its tracks and then struck back with counterattacks of their own. The transformation from Kasserine to El Ghetar had taken less than 2 months, and to the German commanders watching it happen, that was the truly disturbing part. It was not that the Americans had gotten lucky. It was not even that one aggressive general had shaken them awake. It was that the entire army seemed to be learning at a speed no military organization had any right to match, absorbing the lessons of one battle and spreading them across every unit before the next battle began. Behind that speed lay something the German army, for all its tactical genius, had never built in the same systematic way. The Americans called it the Fire Direction Center. It had been developed years before the war at Fort Sill in Oklahoma by officers working through the late 1920s and early 1930s to solve a single problem. How do you make many guns scattered across the landscape strike a single target together, quickly, without each battery having to work out its own solution by hand. The answer they built changed the nature of artillery forever. A forward observer, lying in the mud with a radio, no longer needed to calculate range, and bearing himself, he simply reported where the target was. The Fire Direction Center did the mathematics, computing a firing solution for every gun that could reach, and within roughly 3 minutes, an entire battalion's worth of shells could be falling on a target the observer had spotted moments before. If the target deserved more, the request could climb to division, to corps, until hundreds of guns were bearing down on a single patch of earth. And then there was the technique that put a special kind of dread into the German soldier. The Americans called it time on target. The gunners calculated their solution so precisely that shells fired from batteries miles apart at different ranges and different angles would all arrive at the same point within a few seconds of each other. There was no ranging shot to warn you. There was no whistle building slowly overhead that gave a veteran time to throw himself into a hole. One moment the front was quiet. The next moment the world came apart. 100 explosions blooming at once across the German position. Catching men in the open who had been given no reason to take cover. Survivors described it as a thing that broke the nerves as much as the body. The numbers behind this system were almost impossible for German commanders to believe. Men who spent the war rationing every shell. A single American infantry division fielded 48 artillery pieces, 36 of the 105 millimeter howitzers, and 12 of the heavier 155 millimeter gun. And it could reach out through its network to borrow hundreds more. In the great battles, the Americans concentrated firepower on a scale that simply dwarfed anything the Wehrmacht could answer. At Elsenborn Ridge, during the Battle of the Bulge, more than 300 heavy guns stood behind the American infantry. And on a single day, they threw over 10,000 rounds into the German attack at the crossing of the Ruhr River in early 1945. Thousands of American guns delivered something close to 1,000 rounds a minute during the opening bombardment. Firing tens of thousands of shells in a matter of hours, Rommel himself had written of it plainly, acknowledging the enemy's tremendous superiority in artillery and its outstandingly large supply of ammunition, and admitting that this superiority, together with the enemy's command of the air, had broken his front open and made a sustained defense impossible. But artillery was only half of the terror. Above the German soldier, in the wide skies over France, waited the other half. The Germans gave it a name that carried its own weight of fear. Jabu, short for Jagdbomber. The fighter bomber, and death by Jabo became one of the things a German learned to dread most on the Western Front. The chief instrument of that terror was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a massive brute of a fighter that flew more than 500,000 combat sorties over the course of the war. Its pilots dropped well over 100,000 tons of bombs on German targets, and they did it while losing barely a fraction of a percent of their aircraft on any given mission, from the landing at Normandy to the last day of the war. Thunderbolt pilots claimed the destruction of tens of thousands of railroad cars, locomotives, trucks, and armored vehicles, even if you cut those claims in half to account for the honest exaggeration of men in the heat of combat. The wreckage they left across the German rear was staggering. The imbalance in the air had grown into something that defied arithmetic. On the day of the Normandy landings, the Allies flew more than 14,000 sorties. The German Air Force had fewer than 320 serviceable fighters in all of France, and could put only a fraction of those into the sky on any given day. A German pilot climbing to meet the invasion faced overwhelming odds every single time his wheels left the runway. The reason lay in the factories. The United States alone built roughly 96,000 aircraft in the single year of 1944. Germany, at the very peak of its wartime production, managed something under 40,000 Across the whole war, the Americans produced more than 290,000 aircraft, while Germany turned out barely more than a third of that, and the men were dying faster than the machines. In the first 5 months of 1944, over 2,000 German fighter pilots were killed. In the month of May alone, a quarter of the entire German fighter pilot force died. The veterans who had survived years of combat were being burned away faster than the training schools could replace them with green boys who would not survive their first missions. So the German soldier on the ground learned to hate a clear sky. Any daylight movement on an open road drew the fighter bombers down within minutes. Truck convoys crept forward only at night. Tank columns took hours to cover distances they could have driven in minutes. Because to move by day was to invite death from above, the simple knowledge that American aircraft might appear at any moment strangled German logistics, forced exhausting movements in darkness, burned precious fuel in endless detours, and kept reinforcements from reaching the front lines in time to matter. An army cannot fight well when it can only move in the dark. And yet, for all this weight of steel and fire, there came a place where American firepower could not simply solve the problem. In June and July of 1944, the American troops who had come ashore in Normandy found themselves trapped in a landscape that no amount of artillery could flatten. The French called it the bocage. The Americans learned to call it the hedgerows. And to hate them, these were not the tidy garden hedges of a suburban lawn. They were ancient earthen banks. Some of them 4 to 15 feet high, raised over centuries and bound together by root systems grown into walls that a man could not see through or push through or, in many places, climb. Each field was ringed by them, so that every field became a small fortress. A tank trying to climb an embankment lifted its nose to the sky and bared its thin belly armor to the German anti-tank guns waiting on the far side. The few gaps in the walls were covered by machine guns, and by the deadly Panzerfaust rockets, a handful of German soldiers with automatic weapons could hold up an entire American battalion, field after field after field. The fighting there was a nightmare that firepower could not end. American infantry had to clear each individual field in costly, close-range assaults. The tanks were nearly useless when they could not move through the walls that boxed them in. The artillery, so devastating in the open, could not see the enemy hidden inside the enclosed green squares. In some sectors, the Americans paid something like 1,000 casualties for every kilometer they gained. At that rate, the breakout from Normandy would take years. The Allies did not have the great American advantages. The guns and the aircraft and the endless supply had run into a wall of dirt and roots. And for a few terrible weeks, it looked as though the amateurs from across the ocean would simply bleed to death in the fields of France. And here, precisely here, the Germans came face to face again with a thing they could not counter, because across the American sector, without waiting for orders from above, individual units began inventing their own solutions to the hedgerow problem. Engineers tried explosives, tank crews tried ramming, tried blades, tried anything they could weld together in a field workshop. The whole army began to improvise at once. The most famous answer came from an unlikely place, and it captured everything that made the American way of war different from the European armies. It fought Sergeant Curtis Cullen, a cavalry reconnaissance man from Cranford, New Jersey, was sitting in on a discussion about the hedgerows when another soldier, a man from Tennessee named Roberts, made a suggestion. Why not put saw teeth on the front of a tank, he said, and cut through the hedges the way a saw cuts through wood? Some of the men laughed at the idea. Cullen did not laugh. He saw that underneath the crude image there was something sound, and he set about building it for real. He would later try to give Roberts the credit for the original thought, though in the rush of publicity that followed, The name that stuck was Cullen's own. What he built was simple and brilliant. 4 steel prongs, welded to the front hull of a Sherman tank, fabricated from scrap, and not just any scrap. The steel came from the German beach obstacles, the so-called Czech hedgehogs that the Germans themselves had scattered across the Normandy sands to stop the invasion. When a tank fitted with these prongs drove into a hedgerow, the teeth bit into the earthen bank and pinned the tank's belly down, stopping it from riding up and exposing itself. The Sherman could then grind straight through the wall in a shower of dirt and torn roots and burst out the far side with its guns already leveled, ready to fight. On July 14, 1944, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley watched a demonstration of the device. In his memoir, he described watching in something close to awe as a hedgerow burst apart and the Sherman came smashing through the other side. He ordered them into mass production on the spot. The work went on around the clock, hidden under camouflage netting to keep it secret from German aerial reconnaissance. By the launch of the Great Breakout Offensive on July 25th, only 11 days after the demonstration, 3 out of every 5 tanks in the First Army were fitted with the device. More than 500 of them had been built in that brief window of time. Eisenhower later recalled that the happiest men in all the Allied armies that night were the ones who knew the thing actually worked. Cullen received the Legion of Merit for it. Months later, he would step on a mine in a German forest and lose his left foot. But his invention stayed in service until the last day of the war. The story of that sergeant explained better than any statistic why the professional German soldier had come to fear the Americans in the German army. A sergeant would never have been encouraged to dream up his own tactical inventions. Such things belonged to officers and trained engineers, handed down from above. In the tradition-bound British Army, the idea would have been written up and passed through the proper channels and studied by committees while the men kept dying in the fields. But in the American Army, a sergeant from New Jersey could take a rough idea from a private from Tennessee, build a working prototype in a field repair shop out of the enemy's own beach obstacles, show it to a commanding general, and see it spread across an entire army in less than 2 weeks. That was the thing the Germans could not match and could not quite understand. Their own doctrine had once prized exactly this kind of initiative. But something had gone wrong at the top of the German war machine, something that was slowly strangling the very flexibility that had made it great. While across the line, the Americans were handing a wrench to every sergeant and asking him what he thought. When the breakout came, it showed what the Americans could do when all their firepower was finally aimed at a single point. On the morning of July 25th, some 1,800 heavy bombers were sent against a strip of ground west of the town of St. Lo, a target barely 4 miles long and less than 2 miles deep. Around 1,500 of them dropped their loads, more than 3,000 tons of bombs, and the medium bombers and fighter bombers added nearly 1,000 tons more. The Elite Panzerlehr Division, one of the best equipped armored formations Germany possessed, stood directly beneath that avalanche. The bombing killed something like 1,000 of its soldiers and destroyed its command posts, its tanks, its guns, its radios. Whole units simply stopped existing as fighting formations, buried and scattered and stunned into silence. The cost was not paid by the Germans alone. A tragic error during the bombing dropped loads short onto American troops, killing more than 100 and wounding nearly 500. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the commander of Army Ground Forces, watching from a forward position, the highest-ranking American officer to die in the European theater. The Americans did not hide it. They counted their own dead, honestly. The way they counted their mistakes, and they kept moving because the breakthrough was real. By July 27th, the German 7th Army was reporting 7 separate ruptures in its line that it could not seal. More than 100,000 American troops poured through a gap less than 5 miles wide, and the trickle became a flood that could not be stopped. Within days, Patton's Third Army was activated and racing across open French country, and the hedgerows that had cost so many lives became meaningless overnight, left far behind by armored columns, driving deep into France. The wall of dirt and roots that had nearly broken the American army in Normandy had been turned by the wit of a sergeant and the weight of 1,000 bombers into open road, and still, the greatest test of the American way of war was yet to come. It would come in the winter, in the snow, in the frozen forests of a place called the Ardennes, when the German army gathered its last great strength for one final blow. The blow fell on December 16, 1944. In the cold and the fog, more than 200,000 German troops came crashing out of the Ardennes forest in a surprise offensive that Hitler had staked the last of his reserves on. A desperate gamble to split the Allied armies in two and seize the vital port of Antwerp. What followed became the largest battle the United States Army has ever fought. More than 600,000 American soldiers eventually drawn into the frozen forests and villages of Belgium and Luxembourg. And it became the final proof of everything the Germans had learned to fear. On the northern shoulder of the German penetration stood a low rise called Elsenborn Ridge, and here the untested 99th Infantry Division fought beside the veteran 2nd Infantry Division against the very best the German army had left. The 6th Panzer Army spearheaded the assault, built around elite Waffen-SS divisions that Hitler himself had chosen for the breakthrough. The plan demanded speed. Above all, the Germans had to seize the roads and the crossroads before the Americans could recover from the shock. Everything depended on the timetable, and the timetable began to break almost at once, in places the German planners had never thought to worry about. Near the village of Lanzerath, a young officer named Lyle Buch commanded the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment, a tiny unit of 18 men, joined by 4 artillery observers, 22 soldiers in all. When the offensive struck, these 22 men found themselves in the path of an entire German parachute battalion, some 500 soldiers. By every rule of war, they should have been swept aside in minutes. Instead, they held their foxholes through hours of savage fighting, inflicting scores of casualties on the attacking Germans and delaying the advance of the armored spearhead that was counting on this road. That small band would become the most decorated American unit of its size in the whole of the Second World War. Behind them, on the ridge itself, more than 300 American guns turned the approaches into a wall of bursting steel. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, later admitted that the offensive had failed in the north because his right flank had run its head against a wall it could not break. At the vital road junction of St. Vith, the 7th Armored Division under Brigadier General Bruce Clark held for nearly a week against overwhelming force, throwing the German schedule into chaos. Eisenhower would later call that defense a turning point of the entire battle. But the stand that became legend happened at a small Belgian crossroads town named Bastogne, where 7 roads met, and whoever held the town-controlled movement through the whole region. The 101st Airborne Division rushed there from their camps in France, joined by elements of the 10th Armored Division, and found themselves surrounded, outnumbered by something like 4 to 1, short of ammunition, short of winter clothing, with no way to get their wounded out. On December 22nd, German officers came forward under a white flag carrying a written ultimatum. The fortune of war is changing. It read, it demanded the surrender of the American troops within 2 hours, and it warned that if they refused, they would be annihilated, and that the blood of the civilians killed in the bombardment would be on the American commander's head. The message was carried blindfolded to a command post and delivered to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting division commander, according to the men who were there, McAuliffe read it, muttered a single word of disgust, crumpled the paper, and threw it toward a wastebasket. When his staff tried to compose a proper reply, one of his officers suggested that the general's first reaction had already said it perfectly. And so the official answer, typed on a single sheet and handed to the waiting Germans, contained exactly one word, nuts. When the puzzled German officers asked whether this was an acceptance or a refusal, the American colonel who delivered it explained in plain terms that it meant they could go to hell. The 100 first held through repeated attacks by tanks and infantry, through the cold and the shortage of shells. They held Bastogne, and then from the south, help came in a way that stunned even the men who ordered it. When the offensive had begun, Patton's Third Army was attacking eastward, in the wrong direction entirely. At a conference on December 19th, Patton told Eisenhower he could pull 3 divisions out of the line, wheel them 90 degrees to the north, and attack toward Bastogne within 48 hours. The other commanders in the room could scarcely believe it. Armies did not turn like that. But Patton had already seen the danger coming and had quietly ordered his staff to draw up the plans before the call ever came, so that when the moment arrived, they were not inventing a miracle. They were simply executing a plan already written. On December 26th, the 4th Armored Division broke through to Bastogne, a tank named Cobra King making first contact with the defenders. By the middle of January, the German bulge in the line had been erased, and the Americans were pressing back toward Germany itself. The cost was terrible. Roughly 19,000 Americans were killed, and total American casualties reached some 80,000, but the German army had spent the last of its strength, and it had nothing left to replace it. So the question remains, the one those interrogators kept asking in the quiet rooms of 1945, why could the Americans recover from surprise and defeat again and again, while the Germans, for all their early brilliance, could not hold what they had won? The answer was never really about the individual soldier. By most honest measures, the German infantryman was superb, better trained in fieldcraft and marksmanship, often led by officers more experienced and more inventive than their American counterparts. Frequently equipped with better weapons, the answer lay in the machinery behind the man. The American Army had built a feedback loop that no other force in history had matched for speed. It sent observers to the front and published bulletins of lessons learned within weeks, spreading a good idea from one muddy field to the whole army before the enemy could adjust. When infantry proved vulnerable to tanks in Tunisia, new tactics were developed, tested, and distributed worldwide within months. When a sergeant invented a hedgerow cutter, it was evaluated and mass-produced and deployed across an army in under 2 weeks. The training itself was rebuilt over and over based on what the fighting actually taught, stretched and compressed and adjusted again and again as the reports came back from the front. The system was designed from the ground up to learn from failure rather than to punish it or hide it. Against that stood 2 very different armies. The British were formidable, but they were formidable in a familiar way. Field Marshal Montgomery, shaped by the slaughter of the First World War, fought set-piece battles of overwhelming force and meticulous planning and tight central control. It worked, and it spared lives, but it was slow and it was predictable. A German commander facing the British could usually guess when and where the blow would fall and how it would be delivered. They were dangerous, the way a skilled fencer is dangerous. You could study the technique and prepare your counter. The Americans offered no such comfort, and the Germans, tragically, were destroying the very thing that had once made them the finest army in the world. Their doctrine of mission-type tactics had given junior commanders extraordinary freedom to improvise, to adapt on the spot without waiting for permission. And that flexibility had won them their early victories. But Hitler's growing interference strangled it, the blanket orders forbidding any retreat, the demand for blind obedience, the promotion of loyalty over competence. All of it froze the initiative out of the army at every level. Talented commanders who argued for sensible withdrawals were dismissed or worse. German units that could have adapted found themselves pinned in place by orders from a headquarters hundreds of miles away, commanded by a man who had not seen the front in years. Underneath it all lay the factories, and the numbers there were beyond the German soldiers' comprehension. The United States alone built some 295,000 aircraft, tens of thousands of tanks, over 2 million military trucks, and more than 1 billion rounds of artillery ammunition. The Great Red Ball Express, 6,000 trucks at its peak, driven largely by African American soldiers around the clock, delivered thousands of tons of supplies a day to the advancing armies. American doctrine deliberately spent steel to save flesh, burying problems under shells and bombs rather than trading lives for ground. When supplies ran low, they simply built more. When equipment was destroyed, replacements arrived within days. When a tactic failed, a new one was tested and fielded in weeks. That was the enemy. The German soldier had come to fear not a better man, but a better machine for turning failure into knowledge and knowledge into victory. The British could be studied. The Soviets could be understood as a flood, but the Americans combined the weight of the flood with something worse, an ability to learn in the middle of a battle, to grow stronger after every setback, to appear with new weapons and new methods faster than the mind could follow. When they took fire, they did not maneuver cleverly. They called down the artillery and the aircraft, and then they came straight at you. And they never seemed to run out of anything. The men who had laughed at the amateurs in the Tunisian winter of 1943 ended the war genuinely afraid of them. They had watched an army rise from the worst humiliation of its war to become the thing they dreaded most. And the reason they gave sitting across those tables in 1945 is a lesson that reaches far beyond any battlefield. Organizations that learn from failure will beat organizations that punish it. Organizations that reward initiative will beat those that demand obedience. The most dangerous opponent is rarely the one with the longest tradition or the deepest experience. It is the one who learns the fastest and who simply never stops